Parker Palmer, the author, Parker Palmer, is an author of more than 100 essays and has written 10 books, comes out of the Quaker tradition, wrote in his book, Let Your Life Speak. He said, before I can tell my life what I want to do with it, I must listen to my life telling me who I am. Before I can tell my life what I want to do with it, I must listen to my life telling me who I am. Listen for what it intends to do with you. I must listen to my life and try to understand what it's truly about, quite apart from what I would like it to be about, or my life will never represent anything real in the world, no matter how earnest my intentions. And so I want to take some time to consider the metaphors that we use for listening to our life or to our own human experience, of our human experience in our life as sacred song and sacred text filled with meaning. And I'll draw some from my own experience, as well as from our historical Unitarian roots. We're going to go back in time to the beginnings of our historical faith. And then what more contemporary liberation theology says about some of these same things. I've learned that listening to our lives, or at least this is true for me, isn't always easy, especially during difficult times. There's a period in my life that, when I look back on it, is both a bit painful and a bit foggy. When I was 25, my wife at the time, my wife Josie, passed away from leukemia. Then the years after that, it just seemed like it was a number of different things right after another. And sometimes I have trouble remembering which thing happened in which order, right? I remember things that period of my life started with Josie passing away. But I had a nephew, Jaden, who was young, only 4 years old at the time, and died in a very tragic farming accident, which was devastating to my sister, his mother, and to our family. My father-in-law, Josie's father, Pablo, who I was very close to, thought of him very much as my own father, just a sweet man, passed away. And my own father, Max, died. 4 very sudden, tragic deaths in about a 5-year time period. And during that time, often people would say the things that people say when times are difficult, right? They would say, oh, they're better off, or it's part of a plan. We don't know what the plan is, but we know that it's part of a greater plan, part of God's plan, or God works in mysterious ways. Everything happens for a reason. And if those are beliefs that are useful and helpful for you, I don't want to take those away or critique those. But what I found for myself is that I came to think about those things differently. That for me, I really came to believe that things don't always happen for a reason. Sometimes things just happen. Sometimes hurtful, painful things happen, and we don't expect them, and we don't predict them, and we don't plan for them, and they happen anyways. But the fact that not everything happens for a reason doesn't mean that things are without meaning, right? That we can find meaning in those moments, or I could find meaning in that time period and in those moments. That period of time, as painful as it was a time that shaped my life, right? That the time that I spent gaining support from the hospital chaplain influenced my own choices to eventually go into chaplaincy. I learned the importance of not trying to carry these things alone, but of being in community, of being in different types of community, not only faith community, but in support groups and grief groups and recovery groups and therapy, that there were other things that it took more than one group or one community or one type of community. But all of those things together were part of my story, part of who I was, part of who I was becoming. Our Soul Matters small group packet on deep listening has this section on listening to our lives that inspired me to kind of reflect on this topic, this idea of listening to our lives. And they said that that part of listening to our own voice, our inner voice, and listening to our own lives isn't only about listening to that message, but is thinking about what metaphors we put on for what we're listening to. That if we think about our inner voice as our heart speaking, we might hear one thing and think of listening to our heart. Or if we think of our soul speaking and listening to our soul, we might hear something different. If we think about it as the ache that's buried deep inside me, we hear one thing. If we are listening to our voice of creativity, we might hear something different. So thinking about the metaphors that we create and choose is an important part of listening to our life. And so I want to lift up two potential metaphors to think about. To thinking of our life as sacred song, of thinking of our life as sacred story, of thinking of our life as sacred journey. In our hymnal, hymn number 108, we have a song, a hymn that starts out with "My life flows on, an endless song," right? It was also has been covered by Pete Seeger. There's a beautiful version and very haunting version by Enya. That my life flows on an endless song above earth's lamentations. I hear the real, though far off hymn that hails a new creation. Through all the tumult and the strife, I hear its music ringing. It sounds an echo in my soul, and how can I keep from singing? Our life as sacred song. There's a Rabbi Dania Rotenberg, who has a rabbi who's an author who has this incredible social media presence, has a newsletter that's entitled Life is Sacred Text. And in this newsletter, she often refers to sacred stories that are part of the Hebrew tradition. But she always starts with our life as the entry point. And I think that approach, thinking of our life as sacred, our life as a starting point, our life as sacred text, equivalent to any other sacred text that's out there, has strong roots in our Unitarian tradition. One of our first official Unitarian ministers was William Ellery Channing. And he was a minister that really started to become prominent in 1812. And so just to give that some context, to think about what was happening at the time. James Madison was president, our fourth president, and in 1812, James Madison had just been reelected, so we were still early in the country. Louisiana had just become the 18th state. The Shawnee Chief Tecumseh was leading indigenous resistance to U.S. expansion. And of course, the War of 1812 is one of the things that might come to our mind when we hear 1812. And early in his ministry, William Ellery Channing wrote and delivered what was called the Baltimore Sermon, in which he talked about Unitarian Christianity. Now, prior to that moment in time, the Unitarians were made up of a variety of different groups of people and didn't really call themselves Unitarians. There were that's all right. Just take my word. There were a couple of different groups who were not called Unitarian, and they just went out of my brain. But other groups at the time were calling these people Unitarians as an insult, as a derogatory term. You Unitarians. And what William Ellery Channing did was said, well, let's claim that. We'll claim that term, and I'm going to tell you what that's all about. And so I'm not going to talk about everything that was in that sermon, but one of the things that was, one of the aspects that he talked about that references to what we're exploring here is this idea that the Christian scriptures were stories that were written by people. The fact that they were written by people didn't make them any less meaningful or any less sacred. And the entry point for thinking about those stories were our own lives, our own feelings, our own human experiences, that was the starting point. So often in many theologies, it starts with the text, and then that becomes the lens that you look at your life through. He was reversing that and saying, let's take our lives, and our lives as a lens that we look at sacred text through. And I actually want to pull from a different sermon that he wrote and delivered, in which he discussed his conception of the sacred and the divine and of God. And he uses God language in this essay, and so I'm going to use God language this morning. But what he says in this sermon called Likeness to God, that he wrote that the idea of God is the idea of our own spiritual nature enlarged to infinity. God is our own spiritual nature enlarged to infinity. I love that as a way of thinking about God and of thinking about the divine. Again, much in the way that he was talking about religious texts differently, and thinking rather than having the text up here coming down to us, our lives being the sacred experience that we enter the text, that God, rather than being up there somewhere, is within and going out. And so this is an excerpt from that sermon, from Likeness to God, and it's adapted a little bit to have inclusive language. And he writes, I affirm and would maintain that true religion consists of proposing as our great end a growing likeness to the Supreme Being. Its noblest influence consists of making us more and more partakers of the divine. Okay. So our religion consists of a growing likeness, making us more and more partakers of the divine. It's only in this likeness that the pure in heart can see and commune with the pure divinity. And that was the sublime instruction of ancient sages as well as inspired prophets. It is indeed the lesson of daily experience. And he goes on to say, this likeness does not consist in extraordinary or miraculous gifts, in supernatural additions to the soul, or anything foreign to our original constitution, but in our essential faculties, unfolded by vigorous and conscious exertion in the ordinary circumstances assigned by God. To resemble our Creator, we need not fly from society and entrance ourselves in lonely contemplation and prayer. Our proper work is to approach God by the free and natural unfolding of our highest powers of understanding, conscience, love, and the moral will. We need not fly from society. Our proper work is understanding, conscience, love, and moral will. That is our sacred experience, our sacred story, according to William Ellery Channing, back in the 1800s. It always blows my mind when I look back at some of our Unitarian or Universalist roots and go, oh my gosh, how far ahead of their time they were. But actually that's a misnomer, because clearly they weren't ahead of their time. They were in their time, but these were the things they were saying at that time that are still relevant and resonant today. We have a lot to be proud of in our heritage. There's a saying that some of you have heard before, that William Ellery Channing is writing reminds me of. Maybe you've heard that, the saying that we're not human beings having a spiritual experience, we're spiritual beings having a human experience. Isn't that what William Ellery Channing is saying? And I myself, I think the reverse is true as well, that we are human beings having a spiritual experience and spiritual beings having a human experience. Both of those things can be true. One of my favorite Bible verses, which I think also connects to what Channing is writing and to this idea of sacred experience, sacred story, is Micah 6:8. Micah 6:8 says, what is the Lord? And then depending on translation, can be God or Jehovah or Yahweh. What does that sacred require of thee? But these three things: to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. And I interpret that much in the way that William Ellery Channing encouraged us to think about that. That walking humbly, walking in unity with God, is to live humbly and in unity with that which is sacred, to live a spiritual journey, our lives as sacred text, our lives as endless song. I want to suggest one other thing, or one other component, one other theological idea as we think about how we approach our life as sacred. And so in this Unitarian perspective, there was this bottom-up theology, starting with experience and moving upward. Another theology that does that, that's having more contemporary influence in Unitarian Universalist theological circles, is a type of theology called liberation theology, a theology of liberation. In the 1970s, early 1970s, there were a couple people who kick this off. One was Gustavo Gutierrez, who was a Peruvian theologian that wrote a theology of liberation. And what he was saying was that it's important for us to think also beyond our own lives, but to think about poverty and the experiences of poverty and the systems of poverty and where those come from, and what we do to move towards liberation, to be in solidarity with those who are poor. Around the same time and along those same lines, James Cone in 1970 wrote A Black Theology of Liberation, which looked at kind of bottom-up experience of racism and thinking again, what are our human experiences of racism and how do those shape our lives and our sacred story? And as we move forward, what is it that we do to move against oppression and towards liberation? Mary Daly, who is a feminist theologian, wrote Beyond God the Father, Towards a Philosophy of Women's Liberation. Again, thinking about how is our sacred story impacted by sexism, by patriarchy, and how do we critique those cultures and those systems and transform them and move those towards liberation. All of these taken together means that as we look at our sacred story, as we listen to our sacred story, that an important piece of that might be slightly different from Channing is acknowledging oppression, acknowledging that oppression is real in the world, that it's complex, it's intertwined, it's interconnected, and that everyone has a role in dismantling these systems and cultures of oppression, and everybody has a role in creating new alternatives. The other thing that these theologies of liberation have in common is thinking about, as we talked about last week, who are we listening to? Who are the voices that we're listening to? Who are the relationships that we're in relationship with? Who are we building community with? That our sacred story is not an individual or solitary story. It's a story of community, and it's a story of collective liberation. Now here's the thing. I'm going to go back to Channing for a moment, because there are some connections and there's some affinities that William Ellery Channing, long before there was ever an idea of collective liberation and liberation theology, wrote, "I am a living member of the great family of all souls. I cannot improve or suffer myself without diffusing good or evil around me through an ever-enlarging sphere. I belong to this family, and I'm bound to it by vital bonds." Our sacred journey, our sacred story is not a solitary story. It's a story of people, of community, and it's a love story. As Bell Hooks says in Love as a Practice of Freedom, the moment we choose love, we begin to move against domination, against oppression. The moment we choose love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. That action is the testimony of love as the practice of freedom. And so, this day and days going forward, may we listen to the sacred story of our lives. May we listen as life tells us who we are and who we're capable of becoming. May we listen to the love story of our lives. May we listen as it reminds us that we are each a living member of a great human family of souls. May our sacred stories of joy and of sorrow, of lived experiences and collective liberation help create connection, community, and help us to change the world around us. And may our lives flow on in endless song and in sacred song. May it be so, and may we make it so. Amen, Ashe, and blessed be.